While we're distracted by the midterms, could the biggest of Biden's broken pledges lead to global annihilation? Hello there, you 6 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage towards truth and freedom. Remember, you can watch these videos first and in full on Rumble every day. Unexpurgated, uncensored, unedited. Plus, we have the best and most relevant guests on the planet telling the truth to you every day. See you there. Now, while I enjoy a festival of democracy as much as the next man, things on the news, polls, speeches, all that stuff, I'm also a little bit interested in global annihilation and whether or not either party, whether they retain or gain control of the House, will lead us into nuclear Armageddon seems to me to be a priority worth discussing. You'll all recall that Joe Biden confidently claimed,
"We will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine."
It's not that long ago that he said that, particularly not in the scope of Joe Biden's endless Benjamin Button, but in the proper direction, life.
Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III.
Okay. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III.
Something we must strive to prevent.
There it is, straight from Joe Biden's mouth, that tensions between NATO and Russia ultimately means World War III. I'm sure you'd agree that there are some tensions between NATO and Russia, aren't there?
This is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
I also want to be clear, though.
He's always saying that he wants to be clear, and I want him to be clear, and he so seldom is.
We'll defend every single inch of NATO territory.
It's widely acknowledged that US and NATO officers are now fully involved in Ukraine's operational planning, aided by a broad range of US intelligence gathering and analysis to exploit Russia's military vulnerabilities, while Ukrainian forces are armed with US and NATO weapons and trained up to the standards of other NATO countries. Yeah, but other than training them up to our standards, helping them in the planning and arming them, we're completely neutral. Other than that,
this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
On October the 5th, Nikolai Patrushev, the head of Russia's Security Council, recognised that Russia is now fighting NATO in Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Putin has reminded the world that Russia has nuclear weapons and is prepared to use them, when the very existence of the state is put under threat, as Russia's official nuclear weapons doctrine declared in June 2020. So Putin said that Russia will respond with nuclear capacity if the state is put under threat. And remember, in our interview with Jeffrey Sachs, he explained events all the way back really to sort of 2001, but with particular emphasis on events in 2009 and 2014, remember Obama's heckle, that have led us to this position. Almost like Putin was warning where this continued escalation might lead. But don't take Putin's word for it. Joe Biden said the same thing. Continuing NATO infringement or backing NATO militarily or exacerbating the situation would in effect be World War III. It seems likely that under that doctrine, Russia's leaders would interpret losing a war to the United States and NATO on their own borders as meeting the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. Is it possible that something this obvious could be missed by the finest military minds in history, the greatest military machine the world has ever known, the richest military industrial complex that humankind ever dreamed of? Could they miss something as vital as an explicit warning that were they to use a land war that was non-nuclear to NATO, that they would consider and in fact enact a nuclear war? Could they have missed what seems to me to be a more important detail than Ron DeSantis and Fetterman doing better than expected, and it really not making that much difference, certainly compared to nuclear annihilation? Hey, Fetterman, you overcame the odds. Hey, DeSantis, you're new Trump. Oh, what's that? Everything being destroyed. Oh yeah, let's put it into some new perspective. President Biden acknowledged on October the 6th that Putin is not joking. Yes, I'd agree with that. He doesn't seem to be a person who prioritises humour. Even when he's doing that sort of handshake that seems a bit stupid and funny, seems like a person who's quite serious. Or when he's sort of glumly watching nuclear experiments being carried out, like missiles being launched, bored, the same way that I might pretend to be interested in a school sports day, and that it would be difficult for Russia to use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. Yeah, the tactic of a nuclear weapon does have a bit of a downside in that it destroys the thing we live on. Biden assessed the danger of full-scale nuclear war higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Yet, despite voicing the possibility of an existential threat to our survival, Biden was not issuing a public warning to the American people and the world, nor announcing any change in US policy. Bizarrely, the president was instead discussing the prospect of nuclear war with his political party's financial backers during an election fundraiser fundraiser at the home of media mogul James Murdoch, with surprised corporate media reporters listening in. This is a bit strange. He seems to be saying that there's going to be a nuclear war. What a scoop! In an NPR report about the danger of nuclear war over Ukraine, Matthew Bunn, a nuclear weapons expert at Harvard University, estimated the chance of Russia using a nuclear weapon at 10 to 20%. I like those odds! Now we've gone from ruling out direct US and NATO involvement in the war to US involvement in all aspects of the war except for the bleeding and dying, with an estimated 10 to 20% chance of nuclear war. Seems like we're exacerbating a potentially dangerous situation. Bunn made that estimate shortly before the sabotage of the Kerch Strait bridge to Crimea. What odds will he project a few months from now if both sides keep matching each other's escalations with further escalation? Well, I'm not a betting man or a bookie, but I imagine that the odds are increasing, decreasing. I told you I'm not a bookie. It's getting worse. The unsolvable dilemma facing Western leaders is that this is a no-win situation. How can they militarily defeat Russia when it possesses 6,000 nuclear warheads and its military doctrine explicitly states that it will use them before it will accept an existential military defeat? This is one of those times where perhaps the sort of naivety and innocence of the uninformed is somewhat useful. You could get distracted and sidetracked by all of the analysis of the midterms. That was surprising. Maybe this is because this. Oh, people care more about that than we thought. But what about this? And what does it mean? And should he run in 2024? And what about that? Also, though, haven't Russia got 6,000 nuclear warheads, and haven't they said that they will not accept a military defeat? Yeah, I know, but isn't it cool that Ron DeSantis, is he better than Trump or is he worse than Trump? And what about Fetterman? And Biden, should he run in 20... Is it possible that Joe Biden thinks, I'm going to just die at the same time as everybody now? When it looked like I was racing towards the grave, off stage, likely to be there before most of you, it seems it's going to be a dead tie. And yet that is what the intensifying Western role in Ukraine now explicitly aims to achieve. This leaves US and NATO policy, and thus our very existence, hanging by a thin thread. The hope that Putin is bluffing, despite explicit warnings that he is not. CIA Director William Burns, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, and the Director of the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Scott Berrier, have all warned that we should not take this danger lightly. On May the 23rd, the very day that Congress passed a $40 billion aid package for Ukraine, including $24 billion in new military spending, the contradictions and dangers of the new US-NATO war policy in Ukraine finally spurred a critical response from the New York Times editorial board. A Times editorial titled, "The Ukraine War is Getting Complicated." It's not getting complicated, it's getting simple. If you carry on, you're going to destroy the planet. The Ukraine war is getting complicated and America is not ready, asking serious probing questions about the new US policy. Sometimes we are, in our ignorance, incapable of addressing the complexity of the new financial globalist agenda, the various subcommittees and sub-agendas, and how vague and misleading the bureaucratic language can be. But occasionally, obvious things start to emerge, like, that is a global superpower with a nuclear capacity, and for like half a century, the Cold War was determined by our knowledge that they could destroy the planet, and they could destroy the planet. So should we come to some sort of truce? As Jeffrey Sachs explained in our conversation, that truce has been broken again and again and again. Not by Russia, spoiler alert, which is a phrase that I don't like using. So something that could be portrayed as vague and complex, oh, geopolitics, it's so complicated, so many interests, is actually quite simple. If you keep antagonizing Russia, even if it's through the humanitarian support of the Ukraine, which is obviously sort of necessary and you shouldn't abandon people, you ought consider and weigh that up against potential annihilation for everybody. A week later, Biden replied to the Times in an op-ed titled, "What America Will and Will Not Do in Ukraine." Biden wrote, "We do not seek a war between NATO and Russia. The United States will not try to bring about Putin's ouster in Moscow." But he went on to pledge virtually unlimited US support for Ukraine, and he did not answer the more difficult questions the Times asked about the US endgame in Ukraine, the limits to US involvement in the war, or how much more devastation Ukraine could sustain. So again, we blindly and blithely fall into accepting rhetoric and spectacle instead of acknowledging that there is a clear problem emerging. We're avoiding that simply by pointing to the necessity to support in Ukraine, and Putin is bad, and the midterms weren't as red as they might have been. I tell you what will soon be red. Everything. As the war escalates and the danger of nuclear war increases, these questions remain unanswered. Calls for a speedy end to the war echoed around the UN General Assembly in New York in September, where 66 countries representing most of the world's population urgently called on all sides to restart peace talks. Peace talks which were apparently interrupted by Boris Johnson when he was on a sort of peace mission, peculiarly. The greatest danger we face is that their calls will be ignored and that the US military-industrial complex overpaid minions will keep finding ways to incrementally turn up the pressure on Russia, calling its bluff and ignoring its red lines, as they have since 1991 until they crossed the most critical red line of all. And that's all of our lives, is that red line, in case you think politics is complicated. So, while there's no doubt a thrill to be sought and found in following the midterms, the surprises, the chills, the spills, ought we not also focus on creating global peace at the time of COP27, when we're talking about environmental disaster, climate change proven scientifically, the problems of COP27 being sponsored by some of the world's biggest polluters? We could consider also a more immediate and imminent threat. Escalating conflict between Ukraine and Russia, if it is, as many people now believe, essentially a proxy war between the US and Russia, in spite of Biden's pledges, could mean the end of the world for all of us. And I think that's a little bit more important than which colour those houses are. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the chat. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. Sign up to our mailing list and watch us every day on Rumble in full for free. See you there. Stay free.